the negotiation process as being a dual process, the solution as being, on the one hand, managing with emotional intelligence, wisdom, decency, and far-sightedness the present pain, hurt, anger. That is one component of the strategy. The second component of the strategy is to move forward into solutions. The danger is that if you focus on solutions in the immediate first instance, you trivialize the pain. The danger about focusing on the pain is that you can get stuck in the pain and not move forward. So we need a wise, tough, dual process.
I think the first question should be whether fees should be free or not.
People have had their experiences and their emotions that they're feeling right now acknowledged. There might be a possibility of de-escalating the current violence and things that are going on, and then we can start looking forward.
They're angry that at the 2014 elections, the government that has been voted in promised free education and they're not willing to give it to us. I think we feel undermined, and I think we need a space where the students feel respected, they feel listened to, and then the meetings that everyone calls for will be able to happen. And it's only when they feel listened to that any kind of negotiation, no matter what solution it is, can even occur. And we have the ability to compromise and to think in a very logical manner, and it's a plea from us to say, listen, we have ideas and we want to be heard.
When you speak about free tertiary education, you're not really only speaking about fees must fall, because at the end of the day it's more to me of just a deep-rooted conflict.
Fees must fall and the protests have brought about deeper issues. So a person can say, yes, I support free education, but now there are things such as racial prejudices and now other social injustices.
And if we take a common theme throughout, you actually see that it's about the haves and the have-nots. And it's almost like there's an era of capitalist restructuring from an economic point of view. It's going to require massive change in the world, and we're just on the brink of that.
This is part of a global megatrend. We see that in the United States of America, there's $1 trillion student debt at the moment, and that 1 million students are lining up to march on that.
Things can change, and the notion that if we can't solve all problems now, that we shouldn't solve one, I find it's more an excuse for apathy.
It's very hard to negotiate when you don't understand the person you're trying to negotiate with. So I feel like before you can even begin to start negotiations, you actually have to have some kind of a debrief, or like a TRC for the university or something. Like, we need to know what everyone's thinking, because I mean, as of right now, I can't come up with a solution because I don't know what all sides are thinking. I don't know what is the reasoning. I don't know. I didn't even know what decolonized education was until I had to ask. And even then I wasn't sure. I'm only now learning what it is.
There needs to be sort of like a common ground between the two parties, coming together, finding a solution for the future, not just in terms of fees must fall and throwing money to the problem, but in terms of ensuring that we have true reconciliation, because it seems as though these things are now bringing up what really happened in '94, and they're bringing up, did we really heal from the past?
There's a role in negotiations which is called process evaluator, and the process evaluator assesses the conduct of a negotiation team and provides feedback to that negotiation team. In a sense, you're providing the role of process evaluator. This feedback is absolutely essential that it comes through, because if viewpoints like yours were to be heard, you give the mediation process direction. It needs direction.
There's a lot of power struggle between the different stakeholders, and that's mainly due to ignorance and pride. So the government last year showed the capacity to take control of the situation by actually giving us a 0% increase. But then that was not enough, because it was like putting a plaster on a gunshot wound.
The matter of stakeholder selection and how you arrange that from a negotiation point of view, all the time, it is a hugely important consideration.
It is possible to achieve free education by looking into the structure. And I'm not talking about wastage, because when you start talking about wastage, governments start becoming defensive.
The Auditor General, last year, the report said 25 billion, 26 billion went missing from the fiscus. Stop the wastage, stop the corruption, because there is money. It just needs to be channeled to the right place.
I don't need to know a lot about the runnings of governments, but just from doing economics and just from watching the news, we know that there's a gross misallocation of funds in places where funds should not be. So if we have people answering to corruption and answering to misallocation of funds, we can have some funds to at least subsidize education for a while.
How do we fix this house? And when I mean this house, we're talking about South Africa. Business leadership, political leadership. I have a strong feeling that we don't know what we're dealing with. Until we know what we're dealing with, we can debate here until Sunday.
I believe that technically speaking, it is a classical wicked problem which constantly redefines itself. That's its very nature. And so we need to have sufficient consensus.
When there's a revolution, there are sacrifices. And are we willing to make the sacrifices of losing the academic year for something better to come out of it?
Some people won't even be able to graduate this year, and what we are creating, actually, students, is that we are creating sort of a bottleneck of where people who are leaving matric, they can't enter the system, and the ones that are ready to leave the system, they can't, so that they can be able to contribute to the economy.
What hasn't been said is how the key stakeholders are actually engaging with one another and how they're conversing with one another. It doesn't seem as if the students and Wits management and the state are talking, having adult to adult conversations. It seems very much parent-child. And when you're talking down to somebody, their natural instinct is to rebel. And that wastes so much time. And then this is a time-sensitive situation. You want things done now. You want the academic program to continue, but the conversations being had are so distorted because even when you listen to Blade's statements or Habib's statements to the press, in the way they're talking about students, it's as if like I'm right because I'm older, I know a lot more. And obviously what's going to happen the next day? There's going to be a complete and utter shutdown.
In terms of the negotiation rules of engagement, of cooperation, collaboration, competition, and conflict, in the first instance, what type of problem do we have? Is it a problem of cooperation? Is it a problem of collaboration? Is it a problem of competition? Or is it a problem of conflict?
At the moment we're in the deep-rooted conflict because we're not really agreeing on the ends or means. And how do we deal with deep-rooted conflict? We look at the past. Everyone needs to absorb anger and reflect on that so that we can start being sympathetic and moving forward as a country so that we can move into deal-making negotiations to move into the future of South Africa.
It's a bit of a conflict and a competition. Conflict in a way that what we see in the media, the burning of the buildings, the conflict not going anywhere, there's no negotiation, people don't want to talk to people. But it's also competition because nobody wants to call the next person on the table because you feel like if you call them, they might actually take the spotlight. But reality is, if those people are not part of your discussion, the solution will never be reached.
In addition to government, corporates are the ones that benefit most from tertiary institutions. But I think because of where we stand as a country, whether it be Treasury reallocating some of its money where it's being spent badly into a skills and tertiary institution fund to be so they can spend less money on, say, bailing out parastatals, and then that money gets placed into a fund for tertiary education, where I think it's most important.
We tend to focus on CSR, but what we don't focus on is CSO, which is the obligation that we have to give back. So if corporates raised their percentage of giving back from 1% to 1.5%, that could make all the difference.
You know, if we're going to invest all this money, all this time and negotiations into how we're going to solve the problem, we need to make sure that we're investing into something that's going to provide jobs, So I think varsities might not be keeping up with where the fourth industrial revolution is going.
Building in a practical module / work experience while you're completing your studies would provide students with a grounding in the practical working world, and at the same time generate revenue to bring down the cost of education on an individual level. That way big business would also be able to say, well, look, we've seen these people performing over 4 years, we're quite happy to offer them a job. They're not loaded with debt, they can actually continue and add to society instead of running at a deficit. That being said, looking at tax restructuring might also be a viable solution in the short term to alleviate a lot of the problems we currently face.
Let's say a typical degree costs 50,000 rand a year and it takes 4 years. So you spend 200,000 rand on you and then you sit at home and you do nothing. Universities cannot absorb everyone. So for those who cannot go to university, there should be an alternative path for them to be able to prosper in their lives.
What is the problem? And then we need to define free. What is free? There are those who can afford, and then there are those who are provided for by NSFAS, and there's a missing middle. So that's where the problem is. You increase more pool on NSFAS, then you can cater for most students.
What if the universities or somebody come up with a system that each matriculant is given a ticket who qualifies to study, and after 3 or 4 years, depending on their degree, it becomes redeemable and they can pay for the fees?
There's a lot of work happening around the Business Association of South Africa, where they've been approached to start looking at how can they possibly fund the fees must fall under the national skills banner. So if I can, as a business person, say, if I'm going to be giving you 100 million, 50 million of that will also address my issues. So in the next 3 to 5 years, I will employ those learners to come back into my environment and benefit my sector.
What could be an interesting link is to make the degrees that we need for the country the most free and the most accessible. If you have a small firm that is then developed as part of the university, where big corporates can invest in that business, which is dealing with outside programs, which is dealing with outside work, and students pay off their fees in that way.
If all universities were absolutely free, we still would not have access for everyone who's leaving matric to get into university.
We're in conflict at the moment because the way in which information is being passed back and forth between the students and the university and government is inefficient. The platform which has been created has not been clear enough.
Yeah.
And we have name calling where both parties or the parties involved are saying they're not willing to negotiate. Well, they're moving the goalposts.
The reason why there's no leadership is because universities have taken a neutral position.
Literally all we needed was to come together one day, let's force the government to listen to us. Our government doesn't understand any other language besides us fighting.
That is really problematic, that the only method of communication, the only negotiation method of communication that is understood is conflict. It's a severe problem with our rules of engagement.
Government has failed. This commission that they've set up, where's Treasury? I think we're very far from a solution because the negotiation platforms and the manner in which they're doing it is just wrong to start off with.
And then we need to look at the baseline from last year. What went wrong, how the negotiations failed, and look at the problems but more deeply to understand where we're going and how we're going to get there. And then if we look at subsidized education, corporate contribution to tertiary education or international, because we're only looking at how we can solve it as a country. For this to be executed effectively, leadership has to be in place for a longer period of time than to constantly change it. If the students or all stakeholders involved understand the strategy more effectively, corporates would be able to involve themselves better once they have a clear guideline of what is it we need to do, how will we get there, and this is how we can support it. Instead of corporates donating the money to government, it would have to go straight to universities and thereafter be utilized effectively. There needs to be a 3, 5 and 10 year strategy to solve this problem. And if we look at it, it would be high, medium and low intensity. If we have high intensity, it's solving the problem immediately right now. what can we do? So that could be to write off all the debt we have in terms of education, or funding from corporate or international to try and solve it now. If we take a medium-term approach, it will be the same as last year, and next year we'll have the same problem. If we have a low focus, we will look at universities closing down.
If people want free education, then you should give up your time to educate people. So I think we look at the whole schooling system too linearly. Why don't we look at it in the sense that once you finish your matric, if you qualify with enough points, you then go into almost like an education hub where you learn how to teach people, you learn the necessary basic skills, in which then you go for the next 2 years going to schools around South Africa, teaching students the basics, geography, maths, English, history. And then once you've done that time where you've educated people, then you get your right to free education where you can study economics or you can be a doctor.
What you're saying there comes down to a matter of diagnosis. The crucial element of the diagnosis of what needs to be done is time. The diagnosis has two components to it, as I understand you. One is that we're dealing with a major deep-rooted conflict. And the consideration is at what level do we address that. Number two is that there's a solution which is a business model solution that is required for this situation. So the question is, where do you pitch and how do you address it to be effective?